Hi, friends. I was privileged to have an opportunity to meet with Jackie Lacey just 2 weeks ago to hear the complete story of the criminal justice mental health project that she led in 2014 and 15. For those of you who are not from Los Angeles County, Jackie Lacey was the district attorney from 2012 to 2020. This is an elected position. She was the chief criminal prosecutor for the County of Los Angeles, and she was not only the first woman to be elected to this demanding role, but also the first Black person. We did not talk politics during this interview. We focused solely upon a part of her public service legacy that deserves a spotlight because of the remarkable strides that were made and the leadership she exhibited. Through the force of her passion for this issue, her incredible coalition building skills, and her penchant for inclusiveness, she brought all the relevant players in the criminal justice system together to tackle the tragedy of incarcerating people suffering from mental illness. As you listen to this story, be reminded that the voters did not, per se, ask her to do this. And realistically, her efforts in this space likely did not contribute to her re-election in 2016, because to the general public, they were probably just not aware of what she accomplished. But the results are evident even today, and one has to ask, had she not cultivated this diverse coalition and pushed for results and the funding to implement some important reforms, where would we be today in LA County? Prior to interviewing Jackie, I reached out to several people who were involved with the reform efforts. Zev Yaroslavsky, who was a county supervisor in LA County for 20 years, commended her efforts to bring a mental health diversion court to the San Fernando Valley, and his observation is the perfect way to introduce this interview. This is what leadership is all about, he said, knowing what's right and crusading to do what's right. Hi, this is Carrie Morrison, back for another episode of Heartforward, Conversations from the Heart, and I am delighted to be here in person looking at my dear friend Jackie Lacey. We are meeting this morning to talk a bit about the leadership that she provided to effectuating some true system change in LA County in our mental health arena. So welcome, Jackie.
Good to see you, Carrie. And it's good to be here and talk to the listeners of Heartforward.
Awesome. Thanks. It's so nice to be able to be here in person with you as well, and not on Zoom, which is how I've been doing so many of these interviews. So I really want to shine a light on this amazing endeavor that you led and spearheaded in the county. I remember reading this report in 2015, and I was just about to embark upon my Stanton Fellowship, which of course was focused on our mental health system. And as I read the report, I thought, wow, these are all the issues laid out in such a succinct way with very clear and compelling recommendations. And I was amazed that all this work had been going on behind the scenes, and it was a wonderful revelation. So I want to talk to you a little bit about how you geared up to get involved in taking on this issue. I mean, technically, someone who's elected to be district attorney, the voters don't say, could you please take a deep dive at reforming mental health policy in the criminal justice system? Tell us a little bit about the precipitating factors or the motivation that moved you in the direction of taking this on.
You know, Carrie, before I became DA, there was a case that really inspired me. It was a young student from USC who had gotten arrested, and she was in custody, and her mother knew a friend of mine. She came into my office and she said, my daughter has a mental health issue. She said, she's never done anything wrong. If you agree to get the DAs to release her to me, I promise I'll get her some help. And this woman was a correctional officer. Her daughter, she was absolutely right, had no record. I think she was in her late 20s. She was a grad student. And one day she had a delusion where she thought somebody was after her. So she ran out, saw a car with keys in it, and took it. And the owner of the car struggled with her. And that became a carjacking, a felony carjacking. And I'll never forget it. I looked at her date of birth. It was like 9/24, whatever. It was the same date as my own daughter. And I thought, you know, this could be my kid. And right then and there, I promised myself that if I ever got to be the DA of LA County, I would effect some changes so that this young woman, whose name was Miriam, that this wouldn't happen. And I later followed up with her. She was convicted of a misdemeanor, but I thought about it. What does she tell a future employer? Does she tell them she's a car thief, or does she tell them that she has a mental health issue? Either one was going to make it difficult. And I thought the justice system really should have a separate door for people who fall into this category of being righteously struggling with a mental health issue.
So for our listeners who are not really in this world of the criminal justice system and maybe only think of the district attorney and high profile cases, that we read about in the paper, just give us a basic primer. What is the role of the district attorney typically in the criminal justice system?
Well, you're absolutely right in your observation that most people don't realize what the district attorney does. The district attorney is a constitutional officer. The district attorney is elected to lead an office of prosecutors. And what they do is they evaluate reports of crime and decide what to file, whether to file a case, who to file on. And they take that case from the time it's filed, and they're responsible. They're kind of like, the way I liken it is they're kind of the quarterback of the criminal justice system, because they are responsible for creating the posture of the case as it goes along. And they also have an ethical duty. People don't talk about it very much, but if you think you have the wrong person, or if you think a conviction was wrong, that this is not the right person, you have an ethical duty to not prosecute that person. So it's a great career. I've never regretted a minute of it, because all I had to do was do the right thing, do justice, be led by the truth, and it's a sad system we have, because a lot of times you'll see people who end up taking the lives of innocent victims, people who end up going away for the rest of their lives. And, it's a very serious job with a responsibility.
So when you were elected in 2012, and as you entered in now, you'd been obviously in the department for quite some time as a deputy district attorney. Did you find resonance with your colleagues who had maybe similar experiences as the one you described with Miriam, that they felt conflicted? And did you find resonance in your own team that this was something to take on?
I wish I could say that was true, Carrie. I think the biggest obstacle to the change was my team, because we weren't taught, we weren't trained to really look at, was there a mental health issue behind a carjacking? We were trained, look, if they committed the crime, you might take into account their mental state when you sentence them. But if they committed the crime, that's the end of the story. And the only training I had formally through the office was how to cross-examine a psychiatrist who was coming in to testify and perhaps get someone who murdered someone a lesser charge. And so that was the environment. And it took a while of really talking to the body of prosecutors, listening to what they had to say, and really influencing them that this was the right way to go. This was the right change to implement at this time. And that, more importantly, I would have their back if, God forbid, a mistake happened and someone got out and committed a new crime. And that was the biggest thing. As a prosecutor, I remember as elected, I would wake up every morning at 5 a.m. And the first thing I'd do is scan the internet to see if there were any stories about any cases where we screwed up. And that's really, that fear is real. And it's something that prosecutors deal with. And so with these cases, they are, no question about it, someone with a mental health issue is a high risk individual. You're taking, you are taking a risk. But on the other hand, when you look at the Miriams of the world and others that I experienced while I was DA and got a chance to know, you absolutely have a duty to help them.
So here you have this awareness that there is this fundamental unfairness or injustice in the way people with mental illness are treated in the traditional criminal justice system. You don't necessarily have a lot of compatriots coming alongside you within your colleagues. Who did you start to turn to? Who became your advisors, your champions, your mentors? Because I know you spread your tentacles out to see who would come alongside you in this project.
Well, I had it in my mind, and I actually talked about it as I was campaigning, that I was going to do something different in the DA's office with regard to those who had a mental health issue. But when I first got elected, and I guess this is true with a lot of electeds, there were so many things coming at me, so many immediate challenges that I kind of put it on the back burner for a bit. And it was this woman who worked at the sheriff's department. Her name was Terry McDonald. And she and I became instant friends. And she comes to me, she says, you know, Jackie, I've been looking at the jail system here.
Was she involved in custody operations?
Yeah, she was over it. She said, I've been looking at the people who are in this LA County jail. She said, some of these people just don't belong here. Would you help start a group of people so we could start to talk about alternatives? And that's really how it started. I began to visit other places. I sent people to Miami-Dade. I went to Miami-Dade, looked at their successes, and my mentor became this man, Judge Steven Leifman. He became my mentor. He was the one I would call when I'd say, what about this? What about that? Or here's the challenge, or where's the money going to come from? Maybe
you can describe briefly what it was that was so special about Judge Leifman, because he is kind of a hero in this space.
He's a big deal.
Yeah.
He's a big deal. Judge Leifman, had a similar experience with a case involving a young man who was a medical school student. And this medical school student ended up homeless on the street and got arrested and, was in and out of jail. But what Judge Leifman did, Judge Leifman was probably 10 years ahead of our start. And I toured the new mental health facility that they had. I talked to him a lot about what they did. And I think the most convincing argument or the most convincing evidence that he had was that they had driven down the population of people in the jail by redirecting those people with mental health illness, that they were actually able to close down a jail. And the officer involved shootings, people dying, people getting hurt in officer involved shootings dramatically decreased, and they credited getting people with mental health issues help. And to me, that was like a no-lose situation.
So Judge Leifman, he is a hero in the space. And then Terry McDonald, who I don't think I've had the pleasure of meeting, but I have heard a lot about her. Describe your first impression going through Twin Towers, the mental health pods. All of us who have had that experience of the first time you go through those pods, it's kind of a searing memory. Do you recall that in your perspective?
Yeah, I went through the mental health ward of the LA County Jail, and there are several different levels, obviously, and it changes you. You can't look at human suffering like that and go away and be the same. I think one of the things that really struck me was, and a colleague pointed this out, she said an inmate was meeting with his psychologist, and they were sitting at what I would call a lunch bench, and his ankle and his wrist were chained to the lunch bench. And there was noise. There's always noise in the jail. There's this ambient noise. It smells in there. She said to me, I don't know how anyone could have therapy in this environment and get well. And, it was, how can I can't, it's been like 8 years ago, and I still can't forget that. And, it was not the right place to get well. When you looked deeper at some of the cases, some of them were, you had the serious charge, but then when you looked at the facts, they were what I would say goofy facts. Miriam's, technically it fit the textbook case of a carjacking, but it was not what we envision a carjacker is. And there were a lot of cases like that. Antonio Carrion, he was homeless, getting into a fight on the street. Suddenly it's assault with a deadly weapon, a shopping cart. This is not what, when we as voters think about crime and think about laws that we're voting and applying to that. So I knew there was plenty of room for us to look for places where people could go that would be alternative.
So Terry McDonald approaches you. You see there's a need for this. Then what happened?
Oh, well, where do you start? I mean, I think this was a coordinated effort because right about that time, the head of mental health, this guy named Marvin Southard, comes by and says, I want to talk to you. Congratulations, you're DA. Can I talk to you about mental health? And that was the first time that I can think of in memory where a guy who was head of mental health came over to the DA's office, right? And so he starts telling me about all the resources that are out there that could help. A place called SAMHSA and a few other places that had grants. And he was just saying, look, if you get this started, you as the DA can leverage people to come to the table. And we started with just maybe 10 people. So we brought in someone from the jails. We brought in someone from mental health. We brought in someone from law enforcement. We brought in the public defender's office. And it started off with just a small group. As soon as we started moving, as soon as word started leaking out what we were doing, suddenly we had people calling and saying, can I join? Can I come? And it was the first time you'd have law enforcement, mental health professionals, the DA, the public defender, judges, and NAMI, the families of people who, National Association of Mentally Ill, the families of those people who had been through the system, as well as we had a few people who had actually been incarcerated, who had a mental health issue and were doing well, but wanted to be involved. And so our group grew to about 60 people. And, LA County, we don't really talk to each other. It's so large. There's so many different departments and sometimes there's overlap. And this was the first time you got all of these people in the same room talking. We even had Peter Leisberg from the ACLU and we're like, come on in. And, they were suing, I think, the sheriff's department at the time. So it was risky, right? But I thought, you got a point of view that we need to hear.
So to me, it's extraordinary. I love to unpack how this coalition formed because it is no small feat to bring in such diverse voices and perspectives into a common mission. How did you all define the common mission? Because the mission could potentially be very unwieldy.
It took a long time to really define the mission. And we were lucky. There was a report that came out in 2011 from the Administrative Office of the Courts on how the justice system dealt with people who had a mental health issue. So what I found was my role became more of like air traffic control. And when I say that, I don't mean to, say air traffic control is important, right? But it became air traffic control. It was to make sure that everyone's concerns got heard. And then for me not to always be telling people, this is where we're going, this is what we're doing. But sometimes there would be someone in the group who would say something like, why don't we try this? Why don't we do this? And we all agreed that there had to be a better way. There had to be a better system, but how we got there was challenging. And so for me, what I would do is we'd have these meetings. And what I noticed after the meetings was that people would hang out having individual conversations. And that's really where the real work would go down. People would never, like I saw Mr. Leisberg go over to the police chiefs, or the police chiefs go over to him, or a mental health director and say, hey, I didn't even know you had this. What's your phone number and how can we get in touch with it? So in some sense, the biggest enemy of this problem was a lack of communication.
So these relationships of trust were being fostered among people, which is so critical. And as I understand it, having myself been involved with commissions where I'm always sitting in front of a microphone because we're under the Brown Act and it's really hard to have those kind of collaborative discussions, because this was a private group, more of a collaboration group, a coalition group, you did not have to create public meetings, which really impedes the ability to be open and honest and have a conversation.
Well, straight out, Carrie, at those public meetings, and you and I have been through many of them, their eyes are darting around the room. They're very aware of not just the public, but the media there. You see people reluctant to even admit they made a mistake or they could do better. And that was really the beauty of having just this sit down where we could talk, because then, and I'll give you an example of a story. One of the first things that we decided we needed to do was to retrain police officers, retrain them on how to de-escalate a situation with someone who was in crisis. And originally, the police chiefs were all for it until they found out it was going to need to be 40 hours. And they said, wait a minute, that's going to cost too much. We're going to take people out of the field. I can't afford to have any of my guys go there, right? I can't afford to have that. And I'll never forget, it was the first breakthrough that we had. So the man from the ACLU says, there was dead silence. We thought that was the end. And silence is important in some of these meetings. And then Leisberg from the ACLU pipes up and says, but what about all the money you're paying out in lawsuits?
More silence.
And there was more silence, right? You're absolutely right.
Pondering that.
And suddenly we've worked it out. We shortened the training to 16 hours, but it was a rotational view. But you can imagine if that had happened while you had the media there or the public, the police chief would have felt embarrassed, right? And immediately shot back and said something smart. And then boom, the relationship, the meeting is all over. And once again, we're back to how come we can't get things done in government?
A real logjam. Yeah.
A real logjam.
Yeah.
And so there were many conversations like that. Many log jams. And at times there were people who just wanted to speak out passionately. And we let them, we let them. The parents from NAMI, the executive director from NAMI, and Mark Gale, who belongs to NAMI, sometimes they needed to vent.
Their personal experiences. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
they needed to remind us we're talking about real people, real human beings. And that was important for us to keep our true north. We're going to keep going. We'll figure this out.
I'm really dissecting this because I think political science majors could actually do a thesis on how you pulled this together, because it's very unusual. I can't think of anything else in recent memory where there's been so much cross-sectional cooperation to tackle a gnarly public policy dilemma. And nobody asked you to do this. The voters certainly didn't ask you to do this per se, but you saw the leadership challenge and you took it on. So now help me understand, this had to require a lot of work. You had to pull these meetings together. You had to capture all of these ideas. You probably had massive whiteboard sessions. The report itself is filled with really compelling statistics. And did you have the staff bandwidth to do this? Did you have to hire help? How did you pull that off?
To be honest, it was because we wanted to do it. You know what I mean? We didn't have extra staff. I remember we had brought on someone who was, this report almost didn't get written. We had hired somebody to write it. That person didn't work out. And here we were saying who we're going to get to write it. And so we had Tracy Lopez, who's known as Tracy Whitney now, but she's a lawyer on staff. She's a brilliant writer. And I just turned to her and said, would you take this over? We'll give you all the material. Would you give us a draft? And she did. So the board didn't give us any money to start this. We literally had to draw on resources within our own office. Now, our office is busy. I mean, I think we were prosecuting 120,000 cases at that time, coming in every year. But we found, the truth is, you have a lot of flexibility in government to divert resources, at least temporarily, to projects. And you see people do that all the time. And so we just found people who were as passionate as I was, who were willing to do it. It was a huge team effort, Carrie. A lot of people stepped up and helped and did things in order to get the report published. For the report, we had a summit. That was Steve Leifman's suggestion based on what he did. So we had a summit and got a lot of voices at that summit. And we had a follow-up summit with a smaller group of people. And from there, it was like the train had left the station.
Did you feel that there's a lot of remarkable recommendations in here that I know we are seeing play out even now, and I'll let you talk about them. Do you feel, looking back, was there anything that you weren't able to reach some consensus on? You just had to set it aside?
I wouldn't say there was anything we couldn't reach a consensus on. If there's anything that still troubles me, is that we weren't able to develop urgent care centers, as many urgent care centers as we needed yesterday. We need these urgent care centers yesterday. And that we're still not able to provide enough locked and secured beds outside of a jail for those who need that resource. We are still in this county far short of what we need. And so it was all about timing. I would, as the leader of the group, I would try to say, okay, when can you get this done? What about next summer? And the summer would come along and the person that I was counting on from another department would say, something else came up. I can't get it done. Maybe next year. And then next year became next year. And so the speed at which we could develop full supportive housing and all these other things that we needed, that was the most frustrating thing. People weren't telling me no. They were just saying, we can't do it right now.
Yeah, and that's why so many of your recommendations are still so relevant today, because they have not been fully achieved. So I want to talk about those more in a moment. But first, I wanted to ask you, because I think this may have been part of the strategy to come to these conclusions on what was needed. What is the sequential intercept model? Because I saw the charts and I read a little bit about it, and I thought this makes so much sense. And the whole process of, as a group, creating this for LA County must have been eye-opening. So can you, in your own words, describe what that is?
Yeah, I'm sorry they call it the sequential intercept
It
model.
sounds very clinical.
Yeah, it's off-putting. Basically, what we did is we mapped out the available resources and points at which people could be diverted from going into the criminal justice system. Sometimes there were places, things that happened before the arrest. So it was always my goal to stem the tide of people who were coming into the jail. And by trying to figure out how can we do pre-filing diversion, how can we, those that are in jail that are trying to be restored to competency. Do we really need to do that in the jail? Can't we do that on the outside?
And what does that mean, restored to competency?
It's a legal term. What it means is when someone is unable to understand their charges, they're in such a mental health state that they're unable to understand their charges, they can't participate in their defense, they're declared incompetent to go to trial. Most of the time it's temporary. Sometimes it can be permanent. But when the judge does that, they were in purgatory, which means they're just sitting in jail waiting for the right for them, to be restored, to come back to where they understand what's going on, which often meant medication and figuring out which medication. So people with mental health issues would linger in jail on misdemeanors and low-level felonies for twice as long as someone who didn't have a mental health issue.
So you have the pretrial, you're mapping out the pretrial diversion. Now you're mapping out, you're in jail,
right,
and you need to be restored to competency. What are other examples along that process map?
Well, now we have a new law called pretrial diversion for those who have a mental health issue. So that's another example. Rather than someone having to plead guilty, like the Marians of the world, having to plead guilty if she were coming through the system now, we could say, send her to a mental health place, or let's suspend her case for a year. If she cooperates with her mental health provider, then we'll dismiss the case. She won't have anything on her record. There's also, the revolving door. Oftentimes, someone with a mental health crisis will go through, do their time in jail, get restored, get medicated, go back out, stop taking their medication because after all, they feel fine, right? And end up decompensating and once again end up getting arrested and going right back through the system the whole time. One of the things we discovered is there were opportunities rather than the sheriff's department just releasing people to the streets. How about they release them into a program? A warm handoff kind of thing. What about when they release them? What about they release them with prescription in hand? Things of that nature. So there were many places that we identified through this mapping process that we could double down on, increase, and that would stem the tide of the people coming through the criminal justice system in the future.
So coming out of this process mapping, which I think still is very relevant even today, unfortunately, your group then was able to start to define some of these recommendations that you would want to make to the county and to all the players. So you mentioned crisis intervention training, obviously increasing the number of beds to divert people to. Maybe you could summarize some of the key recommendations that came out of the Blue Ribbon Committee and the ones you feel made the most impact.
I thought the training of law enforcement officers, we talked about that, but I also thought creating what's called co-deployed teams. In other words, when the police get a call that someone's having a mental health crisis and their services are needed, to deploy a social worker, a clinician of some sort with them. And we thought that was key. Originally, we got resistance from the sheriff's department. LAPD was doing that, but they hadn't really they didn't give us as many as we needed for a city and a county of 10 million people. And so the sheriff's department increased that. I can't remember. I think the number was 7. They then increased it to 23. They got departmental health to give them some clinicians. And LAPD, they used to didn't cover 24 hours. I remember when I talked to Charlie Beck the day that they finally said, okay, we're going to cover 24 hours. Because as you know, there's no time schedule for when the cops are needed for a mental health call. So that happened. The big thing, the big game changer occurred, though, when the Board of Supervisors decided to dedicate $120 million to this project, and they created the Office of Diversion and Reentry. That was a huge game changer. And I'll tell you why. Because they didn't have the bureaucratic crap that holds departments back from doing their job. They were nimble. They were able to bring on staff quickly. They were able to contract with outside providers for housing. They were a game changer because not only were they doing this, but they were showing the rest of the county departments that, yeah, we could do things quicker. We could find housing quicker. Many of the people that have a mental health issue come through our justice system are homeless, and a substantial amount are homeless. And so the Office of Diversion and Reentry, led by former Judge Pete Espinosa, really, they were able to just give measurable results very, very quickly, which inspired us too.
I am aware of ODR, and I've had the pleasure of meeting Judge Espinosa. And so I want to unpack this a little bit more because I'm just wondering how this model could be replicated. So you're saying that out of your committee is coming this recommendation to divert people from, as they come out of jail, into supported living with case management and all that they need to get them out of jail, or maybe prevent them from going to jail in the first place. And so the Board of Supervisors agrees to fund it to the tune of $120 million. A, did that money come out of the general fund? And B, when you're saying that the board was able to manage this more expeditiously than the county bureaucracy, somebody had to kind of administer that. So who took over the role of managing the new ODR?
Well, ODR was put under the Department of Health Services. You know, a natural place for ODR would have been the Department of Mental Health. But one or a couple of the supervisors decided to put it under Health Services. And at that time, Health Services was led by, a pretty phenomenal leader who was able to really empower the director of ODR to get some of these things done that we had been waiting for so long. That is the problem with our county being as big as it is, that oftentimes we are in silos and there are rules sometimes that just don't make sense. There are rules about, for instance, with housing homeless people. There are rules such as, well, you got to have an ID. Well, where's your birth certificate? I mean, all of these things. Can we just get you off the street and into housing? Can we just get you help and then worry about that later? You can look at people and tell they're in need without the documentation that's required. Do we have to spend so much money? When I read in the paper how much it costs or how much the government spends, particularly in LA County, on housing people, I keep thinking, is it me? That seems inflated. It seems inflated. And so the Office of Diversion and Reentry really showed, in my opinion, the rest of the county that things could be done using less money and quicker. That said, the Department of Health got a new leader, Dr. John Sharon, who came from, I think he was with Veterans Administration. He too really took the job of mental health seriously. But remember, his population wasn't just the justice involved. It's everyone who has a mental health problem. Not everyone who has a mental health problem is justice involved. So he had other things, other people that he had to focus in on, not just the justice involved. The Office of Diversion and Reentry really focused in on those who were justice involved, and we really needed that. But for the summit, but for us talking, but for us demonstrating that there were so many people supportive of it, I don't think there would be an Office of Diversion and Reentry now.
I've observed that too, just the commitment to even expanding the CIT training, and who knows how many countless of potentially violent or even deadly incidents that has helped to prevent through the de-escalation. And obviously it's not perfect and we still have challenges, but the training does sensitize people to what they're encountering. And until we take law enforcement out of the middle of these crises, which certainly is the national discussion right now, they're the last man standing, unfortunately, at the other end of a 911 call. Just going back again to your leadership, had you not taken this on, many of these things would not be in place right now. And that is kind of astounding to me. I'm thinking about, where does the leadership responsibility lie in a county as large as LA County? Thinking back to the fact that you said the Board of Supervisors actually supported the allocation of funds, and I think this would have been maybe in 2015-ish or whatever.
Right.
Was that a unanimous vote?
It was unanimous. There was always, with board motions, if you look, I think it's Thursday when a motion will come out for review. By the time Tuesday, when the board meeting hits, it's always modified. So there was a little bit of horse trading that went on. Originally, it was going to be the Office of Diversion. But I remember Supervisor Hilda Solis said, we really should add reentry. That's important to me. So that was added as a last minute thing. The board that approved this is different from the board now. And there were some people that had to be convinced. And I am noted for calling people on their cell phone. Don't give me your cell phone because I will call you at 7 a.m. while I'm walking and saying, I'm thinking about you. Let's talk. And that turns out to be a very effective tool. Those side conversations, once again, a very effective tool of getting people to come along. So there were people I had to call, and just say, this is the right way to go. This is what we need from you. I need your help. I need your vote. I'm a career prosecutor. I've been in the business by then, almost 30 years. And so I had some street cred, if you will, in terms of public safety. And so I think that really helped to bring people along. Now, though, it is funny to see it 5 years later because now everyone's talking about mental health, right? I mean, we just watched the Olympics. I have never seen that many athletes come out publicly and say, I am struggling with a mental health problem. And that we ought to be cheering at that moment, right? We're cheering for the gold. We ought to be cheering at that moment. Because, Carrie, you're right. Nobody was running on this stuff in the future. And that's because there's such denial and there's such shame on the part of people who have a mental health issue, families who are dealing with it. People are ashamed to talk about it, to admit that they have an issue. And if they're ashamed, they won't get help. And the more we have people who are influential in our society come forward and admit that they have a mental health problem, I think the better it's going to be for us so we can get past that whole stigma, that whole shame, and start to treat people with what's called parity. Think about it. If Simone Biles, the gymnast, had said, I've been diagnosed with, cancer, I can't perform, no one would have even questioned or thought twice about it. Well, when you say I have a mental health problem, there are still some people in this society who think you're weak. Suck it up.
Get over it.
Get over it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it is not about getting over it. It's about accepting it and doing what's best for your mental health.
I've talked to a few people who were involved in the summit or the post summits. And one of the observations that was shared with me is the fact that you did invite NAMI into the discussion, the National Alliance for Mental Illness. So families, people with lived experience, people who have gone through the crushing challenges of caring for a loved one, that was kind of groundbreaking because it's easy for county departments to try to distance themselves from the humanity of these situations. And that, may have been the start of something.
So you mentioned our budget. Out of our budget, we developed a training academy for the smaller law enforcement agencies who couldn't afford to develop their own training.
That's true. There's more than just LAPD and LASD.
There's almost 50 of them. There's
50 law enforcement agencies in LA County?
Almost 50.
Oh, my goodness.
And many of them didn't have the training. So the big ones, the Sheriff's Department, Long Beach Police Department, and LAPD all had their own training, but the smaller agencies, Monterey Park, all this. So I hired somebody, Sandy Jo McCarthy. She was retired. She had just had 2 grandbabies.
She was LAPD assistant chief,
yeah,
right?
Assistant chief. Mm-hmm. She was in Hawaii. I kept calling her. I said, I need you back. And she put together our training. Well, what I was going to say about the training was, and NAMI's part was, I've sat through the training. When a NAMI parent speaks, law enforcement people lean in and listen. Because just like I started this conversation about the young woman that touched me, that could have been my daughter, same thing. The law enforcement and men and women are listening to NAMI parents and thinking, oh my gosh, that could be me. I could be in that situation. And the NAMI trainers were absolutely essential to training the police officers on de-escalation techniques. Yeah, we could tell them, do this, speak slowly, give the person space. But by bringing in NAMI and those parents, and some of them were people who had been arrested, who have a mental health issue, that was key to changing the culture.
So you could almost see people's waking up to the human condition in front of them.
I could.
Yeah, that's astounding. A couple years later, I think around 2019-ish, you created within your office a mental health division now where you would have dedicated prosecutors. Describe the purpose of that and the results of it, and is it still in place?
So we decided to create a mental health division because this issue was taking off to the point where we were starting to see an increase in the number of inmates who identified as having a mental health issue. And it was growing. And so we needed...
And why do you think that is?
Because I think the stigma was lifted. We started to talk about it more. Reports were coming out. And I think the law enforcement in the jail was much more skilled at identifying, okay, this person is probably bipolar. This person has an issue. And so by doing that, we identified more people. So I created the division because I wanted a centralized place for people to go to get decisions on these cases. Because as I mentioned earlier, these were difficult decisions for many of our prosecutors. And some of my prosecutors were just not suited to make these decisions. We already had some overlap on other divisions, like we had a diversion program for veterans that was started way before 2012. We had a women's reentry court. We had drug courts. We had all these different courts. So we combined those. We had a psychiatric division, but I wanted it under one umbrella so that people wouldn't say, who do I call? Where do I get help? And so we've got this division, and I have my leadership team in there was Gilbert Wright and Tracy Whitney. And they have a series of lawyers who are specially trained on how to look at these cases, how to read doctors' reports, how to determine who's a good risk, where should the person, what kind of housing should they go into. And the mental health division is the first of its kind. And since then, there have been others. San Diego came in and looked at ours, and they started theirs. Others throughout the country have done it. But it's a place, like I said, a niche, a place where people can go when they have someone who has a mental health issue and they need a decision from someone who has expertise in this area.
And so it's still in place.
It's still in place. I hope it's in place forever.
That's excellent. And, again, just trying to discern how the criminal justice system works in this particular realm. Did you have to develop stronger relationships with the public defenders? Because ultimately there needs to be a conversation about, the best way forward for this particular individual.
I was lucky. I always had friends in the public defender's office. I always had a good relationships with opposing counsel because I always saw the public defender's office as doing important work, upholding the Constitution. They were doing their job. Our goals may not have been the same, but I respected what they did. And so I knew they had to be at the table in order to have this discussion. Because, a public defender could say, I don't want my client diverted. I don't want my client to go into housing. They're only going to do, jail. The jails are overcrowded. Just let them plead guilty, let them go through, and they'll be out in no time, and they can worry about the future on the outside. But it was important to have the buy-in from the public defender. And we had some phenomenal public defenders as part of our criminal justice mental health division or mental health task force that provided great insight into the process. For instance, there was one time where we were talking about conservatorships, and conservatorships, for people who may not know, or when you go to court and basically the court has to determine that the person is unable to care for themselves. And so some other adult is going to make the decision. And for us on the DA's office, we're thinking, oh, this is great. If we can get people into conservatorships for the rest of their lives, that'll make things easier. You won't see people back out on the street. Well, Vera Bradford, who's a public defender in our meeting, said, people have the right to be free. And it's good that these conservatorships are reviewed annually, because really, should someone be under the control of another person for the rest of their lives? And so this was like, reminding us that once again, we're dealing with human beings. Look at it from their side of the table.
Another great example where you can have that free discussion in a room where you're building trust and, that notion that everyone's touching the elephant with a mask on. But ultimately, you've got to put the whole elephant together.
That's right.
Yeah, that's a great example. I want to switch gears a little bit over to Trieste, because that's just been my goal, is to help people always see the North Star, that there is a better way to treat people. When we just want to throw our hands up and say, wow, this is the best we can do, we are saddled by systems and policies and rules that make it impossible to really help people, especially with serious mental illness. We can say, no, but we have seen a place where they do it better. And the World Health Organization says it's so, right? So I appreciated that in the first delegation that I took in 2017, while I was still a Stanton Fellow, you sent Tracy Whitney, who had, as you say, put this report together. And she was a really important member of that team. And she was looking at what they were doing in Trieste through the criminal justice lens. And she was with the group that met with the judges and the law enforcement over there. And then we had our friends from Trieste come in 2018, and they toured our system, and you graciously hosted them for lunch. I think that was the day after we had been in Skid Row. It was a pretty grim morning for them. And then you came with the group that returned in 2019 to attend the international conference. And we had leaders from state and local government and nonprofits and others. What do you remember about what you learned about that system, attending that conference, and some of the site visits that week?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I encourage everyone to go to Trieste. It is a wonderful, hospitable city. And there are great professionals there who I'm just honored to have met them. But what I noticed, what struck me about Trieste, is that the area where we stayed was on the waterfront. I didn't see a single tent. I didn't see any homeless people. I didn't see anybody doing drugs. I didn't see any fights going on. And we're so desensitized to that here in LA County that it strikes us as a little strange when we go to a city like Trieste and don't see that. What also was somewhat embarrassing is even before they went on that trip, when they got back from the Skid Row visit, you could tell they were like, how could you in America let this happen? And there was a bit of shame as an Angelino that, wow, how did this happen? How other people are looking down on the United States, on a part of the United States. What I got from the conference I went to is this term of, I think it's called, and correct me if I'm wrong, radical hospitality.
Mm-hmm. In Italian, it's accoglienza.
Yep. Accoglienda.
It's its own special ethos.
We got to care more. That's the bottom line, is by not doing anything, by allowing people to basically decompensate on the street, how is that compassionate? How is that caring? And that's what I left Trieste with, that it is possible. I always wanted LA to be the model. Trieste is the model. That is the model for what we should be striving. Now, I will say this. From what I can gather, they didn't have the drug abuse problem. They didn't have the methamphetamine problem and the cocaine problem that we have here in LA County. That said, they had wonderful places for people to get well in that I know can be duplicated here in LA County. And I think you would see more people reach out for help if we could get to the point where we could model what they've done.
Yeah. And one of the things that particular conference we went to, I don't know if you recall, that they spent a good couple of hours with a woman from the United Nations. They are big believers in the Declaration for Human Rights, and particularly the Covenant for People with Disabilities. She did a whole presentation on what they call the World Health Organization Quality Rights Initiative, because human rights are different than constitutional rights. You have a human right to housing, which we don't honor in the United States. They believe that restraint is actually torture and that people have a human right to not be restrained in a psychiatric institution. They also believe that people have a human right to a sense of purpose, which I think is beautiful. So I'm still trying to find someone to talk to for this podcast who can unpack what is human rights versus what we call rights in America, because I think there might be a little bit of the secret sauce in that.
There could be. You indicated you were going to bring this up, and I just want to tell you this is above my pay grade in the sense of understanding the United Nations and their goals. From the limited research I could tell, there's a lot. Politics kind of gets in the way of doing what's right, purely what's right. But I do think that even without a declaration, even without a formal document, we all agree that there's a certain degree of dignity that we're all owed no matter who we are. And especially if we're sick, there's a certain degree of dignity that we're owed. And if we can, as adults, as human beings, agree to that, we should be able to press forward. The restraints, it's difficult. People will tell you that folks are restrained sometimes to keep them from hurting themselves. Once again, I think our goal ought to be restrain as little as possible, only in extreme circumstances. And let's try to get people help early before they get to the point where they have to be incarcerated. One of the things I have told my lawyers and my public defenders also, there are cases where, when someone takes someone else's life, someone kills someone, we really don't have a choice. We have to, the justice system has to respond to that. But so many of the people who have a mental health issue are stereotyped as dangerous, and that may not be true.
Yeah, it's unfair. And especially when you really try to understand the precipitating factors, as in the case of Miriam. So I just, as a student of leadership and policy, want to thank you for taking on this enormous task of forging ahead the blueprint for change, because it is clear that there are things in place right now in LA County that, had it not been for your leadership and your ability to bring people together, I like to think about in the play Hamilton, bring the people into the room where it happened.
In the room where it happened.
And to create that trust and the relationships that were forged and the ability to kind of explore ideas and to act on them and to engage the Board of Supervisors to devote the funds. I mean, these are no small feats. And I really wanted you to be able to tell this story today, because that is a really key legacy of your service as district attorney for LA County. And so now, as we move, we're into 2021, and I know you're a person of faith, and that and I am as well. We believe that there are seasons in our lives, right? And now you are entering into this new season, discerning, what are you called to do next? Because you have a lot of passion and a lot of talent, and you also have a huge heart. So you may not know yet what you're being called into, but I'd be curious to know what you're thinking about.
As much as I enjoyed the job of being district attorney, I realized that, it's good for me to have this break right now, because the hours, the responsibility, the pressure, I had no idea how much it was until, I got out of it. Now what I'm doing is really trying to be in the moment, Carrie. There are so many things that got overlooked in my life, so many people that got overlooked because I was too busy trying to be the district attorney and being the first woman and the first African-American to hold that job. You do not want to screw it up. So you're constantly judging and putting pressure on yourself and trying to really do the right thing to the point where your quality of life suffers. So now what I'm doing is taking a break. I'm reflecting on things that happened, particularly in the last couple of years. George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd just changed us all, right? And the movement that followed. Reflecting on that, reflecting on what's next for my life. I believe God has a plan for me. I'm just too healthy to just ride off into the sunset and be a retiree. But I just want to listen to that voice that tells me what's next. And I don't want to rush it. I don't want to do anything that someone else wants me to do. I hope that I will still continue to play a role in mental health, because I think my voice as a prosecutor, as a former prosecutor, is important to leverage that more conservative side of the justice system. I care tremendously about people who have a mental health issue. And I want to make sure that we continue to move forward in this direction, that we don't give it up, don't get tired, don't get weary. You know, when I started looking at the mental health system and making these changes, I thought it'll take us a decade in LA County before we really see a big change, a tremendous change in how we do things and how we treat people with a mental health issue. So we're 5 years in. There's 5 more years to go. There are other people that I know in the system who can and will lead. And I hope to be, in some sort of supportive role, maybe on a bigger level, on a national level. There are people who think you can't do this. And if it wasn't for Judge Steve Leifman encouraging me and being there for me and saying, no, Jackie, you can do this. Don't worry. Hang in there. I don't know if I would have kept charging ahead. So of all the things that I have accomplished as district attorney, this is the one I'm most proud of.
As you should be. And it's music to my ears to think that as you complete this time of rest and discernment and just listening, that you will come alongside Heartforward and what we're trying to accomplish as well. And I would be so, so excited if we could partner on some things together.
That would be awesome.
Well, thank you for being here today, Jackie. And I just wish you the best day today.
Thank you. And continue to do the work that you're doing, Carrie. It's so very important. And I just commend you for your leadership in this area.
Thank you. As you hear Jackie describe what was accomplished and give credit to all the people and organizations who were involved, think about the possibilities. If we had more leaders like Jackie willing to work behind the scenes to bring people together, to cultivate an atmosphere of trust in a room where there otherwise may be suspicion, what more could we do? Clearly, there is more work to be done in this space, and many of the recommendations in the Blueprint for Change remain relevant today. I hope some who listen to this interview will be inspired to do what they can to emulate this approach that Jackie and her team fostered to move the needle on some of our more pressing issues in the realm of the justice systems that address mental illness, substance use, and homelessness. Our next episode will feature a frank discussion of arguably one of the most complicated issues facing our mental health system. How do we pay for mental health treatment in this state and in this country? I have been looking for just the right person to talk to, somebody who can condense this down into terms that lay people like me can understand, and someone who has the passion to seek change. Join me on episode 9 of Heartforward to hear the conversation with Alex Briscoe, currently the principal of the California Children's Trust and the former director of the Alameda County Healthcare Services Agency. Thank you to Peer Mental Health for serving as my collaborating partner on this podcast, and to Paul Robinson for his technical support as editor. See you next time.